to remember to do. And I have a slide deck that I am going to go ahead and share with you all. And while we're kind of getting started, feel free to put your local league name and your name in the chat, so at least we can have some semblance of what convention is normally like. Great. So this is a presentation that's adapted from a presentation that we did for Albany Law School, where they brought in a election official, a state election official, an advocate, us, and then also a more sort of technical private lobbyist and election attorney who works on the other side of things, representing candidates who all kind of came together and talked about what were some of the problems in 2020, what were some of the positive things that happened in 2020, and us three as three very different people, very different individuals representing very different interests, what were the things that we thought could best fix our elections going forward. So this is a quick recap of 2020 and some of the ways that we engaged in the 2020 election in spite of the pandemic. We did a lot of remote voter education. We did quite a significant amount of voter engagement as well. Our leagues across the state engaged in lots of candidate forums and virtual trainings. We also had some in-person registration as well in some parts of the state. And then something else that we did was election protection. And this is the second or third year we did this, where we partnered with the election protection hotline, that 866 Our Vote hotline, and basically was on the back end of that, helping to address any problems that were coming up within New York State related to the election. So here's just a quick list of some of our partners that we had for 2020. Let New York Vote, of course, is always one of our biggest partners. Disability Rights New York was a newer group that we partnered with one-on-one to do a number of remote trainings on how to use some of the new options for voting in 2020, of course, election protection. And then also we worked with a number of language access advocates to translate some of our materials into other languages, especially the absentee voting materials, since a lot of that was brand new to people. So what did we learn from all of this? The first thing we learned is that people like options. Voters like options. They liked having the opportunity to vote in different ways and not just go and vote in person on election day, which is very limiting. The second thing we learned is that funding is the #1 barrier when it comes to implementing new reforms. Many Board of Elections have told us they would love to do more. They'd love to have more early voting poll sites. They would love to process absentee ballots quicker, but it's very hard for them to do that with the limited funding that they have. And then the third thing that we noticed is there is a huge lack of uniformity of actual county boards of elections around the state. And that lack of uniformity results in a lack of equitable access throughout the state as well. And while one county might be doing things one way, their partner county, a few county overs, might be doing something totally different. And we're going to dig into each of these and sort of how we think they can be addressed moving forward. So first of all, I just wanted to sort of highlight the breakdown of how people actually voted in 2020. And I think this is kind of an impressive feat that we had so many people voting early this year, considering our first time around with early voting, we only had about 200,000 people in 2019 take advantage of that. This time we had 2.5 million people vote early in New York State. We also had 1.2 million absentee voters, and our total voting population for the general election was 8.7 million voters, which is almost a full million more than the State Board of Elections was originally predicting when they said we were going to have record turnout of 8 million, and that was pre-pandemic. They said that, and we exceeded that expectation, which is awesome. As far as our options for voters and what voters like and how we think this whole opportunity, options, multiple ways to vote can be improved, I think all of us at the league noticed the same things. There was a lot of confusion around how to vote by absentee. People had never done it before prior to 2020. Only a really small population of voters, about 4% of voters, would vote by absentee ballot. So it was very confusing for voters. And as far as early voting, I don't think I have to tell you guys, you all know the lines were outrageous in every single part of the state. There really wasn't a single county that escaped the long lines. Maybe a few counties where there was only one early voting site and a particularly far out place that most voters couldn't get to because it was just too far, was, an hour away. So the things that we'd like to see is ballot tracking. This was a huge issue where a lot of voters, particularly in New York City, their ballots, they didn't know where they were. They didn't know whether or not they were going to be received. They maybe didn't even get them in time to use them. And New York City did have ballot tracking. There was actually quite a few counties that had a limited ballot tracking service, but because it was brand new and they'd never used it before, it was a little slow. It didn't update quickly and people just didn't feel comfortable. So some sort of statewide ballot tracking system would definitely help alleviate some of that stress. Prepaid postage as well. For the primary, there was prepaid postage for absentee voting. There was not for the general election, and that's a huge problem. We should not be putting a tax on people to be able to cast their ballot by absentee. So that is a huge priority for us to make sure that anytime a voter is going to vote by absentee, they have that prepaid postage for returning the ballot. Universal ballot drop boxes is another really important one. We did see the executive order that basically said county boards of elections had to have ballot drop boxes at all of their poll sites that looked very different in different parts of the state. In some areas, it was somebody collecting the ballots in a bag. In other areas, it was a nice cardboard box that was very clearly labeled. So we would like to see some sort of universal ballot drop box system, maybe even having ballot drop boxes outside of the regular polling locations, maybe having one at the center, with the town center, or having one at the town hall, of course, with security in mind and making sure that those are secure, those drop boxes. And then finally, maintaining current return deadlines. This is unfortunately something that did pass in the negative in the legislature this year, where they actually rolled back the deadline for voters to return their absentee ballots. So now, instead of having 7 days, they'll have, or instead of requesting their ballot 7 days ahead of time, they'll have to do it 15 days ahead of time. So essentially, we took away 7 days that they could be requesting absentee ballots. That's not really a great policy. So we're hoping the governor doesn't sign that one into law, but we're a little bit pessimistic about that one. And those are just a few of the absentee voting things we'd like to see done. On the early voting side, I think the ask is really clear and really simple. We'd like to see more access to early voting. We'd like to see more poll sites, and we'd like to see more hours. Plain and simple, very easy ask. As far as funding, which you may have noticed in my earlier slide, I said that was the biggest barrier. The lack of funding is enormous in New York State, or has been enormous in New York State. And when we first sort of had these policies put into effect, there was never a clear funding stream of, okay, every single year counties are going to get this much for early voting, or okay, every single year for absentee voting, we're going to give you extra because now we're removing the cause for absentee. And funding is going to continue to be an issue as a lot of our election equipment is aging out. It's becoming more expensive to have cybersecurity experts on staffs for county boards of elections to make sure there's hacking mitigation, that there's no risk that technology within the actual board of elections offices is potentially at risk for hacking. So it's just going to keep getting more and more expensive. And this year we were extremely successful in securing funding for boards of elections, both at the state level and the county level. We were able to secure $1 million in additional operational funds for the state board and $5 million for new election programs. For county boards, we were able to secure $2 million specifically for early voting expansions, and then $20 million to reimburse the cost of technology and equipment upgrades. So this is a great start, we think, especially for an off-cycle election year, if you want to call it that, although I know in many parts of the state, especially in New York City, this is not off-cycle by any stretch of the imagination, but this is a great amount of money for elections, and we hope that in the future there'll be some sort of regular state funding stream, particularly in major election years for counties, so that they're not struggling to find the money to have more poll sites, more poll workers, more security, more people processing ballots, that they can just do it and not have to worry about the money. So here I sort of list out the need for the annual investment in early voting, the need to invest in equipment upgrades, and then the potential need for investment in county boards of election. And the reason I'm saying that is for the third point of the things that we noticed from 2020. which is there is a huge lack of uniformity with county boards of elections. Part of this is because the policies currently in place are sort of loosey-goosey. There isn't a hard mandate for most policies that county boards have to follow. It's pretty open to interpretation. And what we've noticed is that has caused a lot of inconsistency and transparency. You can go on one county board of elections website and it's great and you can find all the information that you need. And then you can go on another one and it's just a link back to the state board of elections. They don't have any information. They have the names of the commissioner, the address, the phone number, and then a link to go to the state board's website to look for information there. That's not acceptable. There is also inconsistency in reporting. It is very hard to find election results just in general in New York State. And part of that is because there isn't a firm mechanism in place to mandate county boards to report back to the state on our numbers of votes as they're coming in, which is why a lot of people get very frustrated when it takes so long to count ballots. And there's also no preliminary data of how elections are going. There's inconsistent implementation of new policies. Unfortunately, what we saw in 2020 is not every county board of election followed the rules. And in some cases, the league had to step in and say, this is what the governor said, this is what the legislature said, you are not doing this, you need to get into compliance, and basically tattling on them to the state board of elections in some cases because they didn't want to accept online absentee requests or email absentee requests. They didn't want to allow for these expansions. They didn't want to waive the wet signature requirement for absentee voting that would basically allow voters to be able to apply to have an absentee ballot instead of with their pen to paper, be able to do that online. And that's just not acceptable. And part of this is because of inconsistent staffing. There's certain county boards that have really nice big workforces, and then there's others where everyone's part-time and there's only like 4 people. That's not acceptable. And inconsistent funding as well. There are certain county governments who are very, very supportive of elections, of democracy, and fund their county boards of elections. And then there's other counties that give them as little money as possible, as little as they can get by with, that's what they get. And I would say in total, all of these things have just shown that there needs to be some sort of reform to our county and state board of elections to make sure that voters in Hamilton County, voters in New York City, and let's say Queens, voters in Nassau, voters out in Erie County all have the same opportunity. They all have the same level of transparency, and they all have the same opportunity to vote and are not hindered because of the inconsistencies within their county board of election. So these are sort of our high level recommendations, or not even recommendations, just sort of our thoughts on Board of Elections reform. And these aren't necessarily set in stone. Really, as a larger coalition, Let New York Vote and some of the other voting coalitions and voting groups are just starting to think about this whole concept of reforming boards of elections. We're kind of lucky in a way because this is the first time we've had the ability to take a moment to sit down and say, we did all the good things. We got early voting, we're expanding absentee voting. Now we can do sort of the big picture things instead, which is great. So some of the things we've recommended are staffing and salary standards. That's sort of a very boilerplate thing. Transparency and accountability, having a minimum level of transparency and reporting, also having open meetings. Most county boards of elections do not have open meetings, and they tell us, oh, well, it's because any business we do, you're going to see what happens anyway, or we don't do anything and we don't make any decisions in private. Everyone knows what we're doing anyway, which that's not really true. And that's not really a good excuse. Also, making sure that boards of elections all have comparable social media presences, comparable websites, comparable information available to voters, because it's really not fair that a voter in, not to pick on Hamilton County, but Hamilton County, all they have is the name of their Board of Elections commissioner and a link back to the state Board of Elections. Meanwhile, New York City's website is a beautiful, well thought out website that is very easy to navigate. And finally, uniform standards and practices that have an oversight authority, because right now, if a Board of Elections doesn't listen, isn't following the rules, you can sue them, but that's about it. There isn't really a good way to sort of punish them, chastise them, force them into compliance. Even the state board of elections has had issues where a county's not listening and they write them strongly worded letter after strongly worded letter after strongly worded letter, and nothing ever really gets done because there's no teeth. There's no enforcement there. And I know some of you are familiar with the Brindisi-Tenney race, where there were commissioners that basically had done some bad things when it came to counting of some of the ballots and were essentially forced to resign. But the question came up of who can even make them resign. And the Board of Elections in that case did write them a strongly worded letter, basically recommending that they step down. But essentially, it turns out the governor is the only one who can force county Board of Elections commissioners to step down from their office. So there's definitely a need for a greater oversight authority there. Which sort of brings us into the next part, where Sally Robinson, our VP of Issues and Advocacy, is going to take over and talk about the potential of a study on the structure of election administration in New York State, which is beyond what I'm talking about here. It's a much bigger thing than what I'm talking about. So Sally, take it away. And Sally, if you're talking, you're on mute.
I just unmuted myself. I was just saying that I don't think I could talk as quickly as you did, but I'm not sure I have as much to say either. Maybe I can just answer some questions. The board is recommending, the state board is recommending we expect to be a 1-year study on the structure of election administration in New York State that would cover both the state administration at the state level and administration at the county levels. A lot of the issues that Jennifer was just talking about that go to the control of the county boards and the standardization across county boards. So a little bit of the history here is that most of our election advocacy in the state is based on National's position on the right to vote. We have a separate campaign finance, state specific campaign finance position, but most of what we've done in the last few years is based upon National's positions. We did at one point in time, and I first heard about this when I first became Issues VP, is that we were one of the original groups pushing for bipartisan administration of elections. And the only thing I've ever been able to find is a reference in Impact to a 1973 position that recognized the state responsibility for uniform and efficient administration of elections. But I've never seen the actual language of that position. And in 1974, a year after we had that position, then the bipartisan state board of elections was established. And I think all the things that Jennifer was just talking about from the 2020 election goes to the issues that have caused it's not as if sort of academics and good government groups have not known there are problems with the Board of Elections for years. But I think 2020, and Jennifer, you can chime in now, I think it really brought it to the forefront because there was a series in the New York Times. There were different because the 2020 election was viewed as so important, and because of the pandemic and because of a bunch of it was sort of like a perfect storm. I think there was a lot more attention in 2020 than there had been in previous years to how elections are run in New York State. Okay, what's the last point? Let me get rid of that. Okay, so there is the agreement that state and local boards are in need of reform. So we can go to the next slide, Jennifer. So the Constitution has state Constitution has a relatively brief section on election administration, and it goes to that boards or officers that run elections shall secure equal representation of the two political parties. And that has been extrapolated to hiring patronage hiring by the parties, and all the way up and down all the employees at the boards of elections all over the the state. And that, I think, was one of the things specifically that the New York Times series went to with the New York City Board of Elections. The New York City board is made up of all the other counties have 2 commissioners. Each county has 2 commissioners, each county getting 1 commissioner per party, but New York City has a 10-member board that functions as 1 board, 2 from each county, 2 from each borough. So the practical effect of interpreting the political parties has meant that we have a very politically controlled patronage system and a lack of accountability. It's not one of the things that I think we'd be digging a little deeper into is what could be done outside of a constitutional amendment. But I do think that most people are thinking that we need to sort of blow up the system and start from scratch. But there may be some things that can be done short of a constitutional amendment. So Jennifer, we can go to the next slide, Jennifer. So this is just sort of an outline of how, in my mind, the study would start. The first thing it would do, would be to look at how other states structure their elections. And the majority of them, I mean, just a spoiler alert, the majority of them actually have 1 elected or appointed official, like a Secretary of State kind of official that runs elections in the states. We'd also look at other state league positions on election administration in their state. We look at some reports and things that have been done by other groups. Common Cause just had a study came out, but it's mostly, as I interpreted it, it's sort of process oriented, is how the legislature should go about what should be the goals, as opposed to saying that this is a specific recommendation. And that may be the direction that this study would go in, because in fact, a number of our positions, as opposed to saying this is what we think the system should be, go to this is the criteria and the goals of any system that we would like to see that system meet. So it would be sort of more of a standards by which the board could evaluate proposals, and then it would be a specific structural recommendation. But those are that's sort of I think the steps by which the committee would start looking at this. It would start by looking at what other states do, other groups' recommendations, how we want to approach, and lastly, like, how do we want to structure the position in terms of, what it is attempting to do. And I think it's more likely, if it's like most of our other positions, which are meant to sort of be in there for the long run and be in there to allow the board to evaluate specific proposals, it would be a little more general and less, super specific about the recommendations. But it would at least give us the ability to go out there and be a sort of more active voice in the discussion going forward on what should be done about the structure of election administration in New York. So that's about it. Maybe I did talk as fast as you did, Jennifer. So Cindy, maybe we should just see if people open it up to questions, or you can add anything you want, and then maybe we open it up to questions.
Nope, I don't have anything else to add, and we already got some questions. Patricia asked a couple of them. The first one I thought I saw was about, hold on, there's even more questions than I thought. Well, I remember the first one, as I'm looking for it, was about why we wouldn't, if we would push for a nonpartisan commission over having a bipartisan structure.
I think that's one of the things, one of the first things that the that would be one of the things that the committee would be looking at. I mean, I don't know if you can say ahead of time. I know that a system, that there's a lot of dissatisfaction and a lot of downsides to the system we have now that is controlled entirely by the two major parties. So I'm looking at the other questions. Let's see, I'm going below. Are there requirements for commissioners of elections? I think, just as far as I know, and Kate may know better, I think it's just that they get the party to appoint them. I'm not sure there are any other criteria. Maybe they have to be a voter.
Yeah, they in New York City,
yeah.
they must be
Yeah.
an enrolled member of the party
Right.
to which they want to be appointed, but there are no formal requirements. I
Yeah.
don't know what the protocol is in the other counties in the state, but in New York City, that's the only one. And I believe it's in the statute about the being enrolled in the county as in the party.
Yeah, I think you might be right, because in addition to the Constitution, there's a more specific statute that goes to give the major parties even more control than the Constitution does.
Right. Right.
Let me see if there are any other questions here.
There was one from Bella about how detailed might the study recommendations be, and then she said she likes the idea of looking at structure, but seems like there's a lot of transparency, spending, staffing, etc. issues that could be looked into.
Oh, yes, there definitely are a lot of very specific issues and recommendations we could make that go along the lines of what we do in a lot of other, I call sort of government process things, which we do in a lot of other areas. So that, yes, I think it can be very specific there, but how specific it will be with structure, it's, it may be a little less specific as opposed to structure, and instead give criteria for what we want to have accomplished in the structure. So will it dovetail with the, I have read the Common Cause report that Sarah and Susan put out. I don't know specifically about anything else that Let New York Vote is doing with, I don't know what Common Cause or Let New York is doing as beyond the report that Common Cause published. So the answer is, I don't know
Kate and
what
I
else
can
they're
kind of
doing.
answer that a little bit more,
Yeah.
because we're both, there is a committee that Let New York Vote has that both Kate and I are on. They got up going early in the session, and then I think just the COVID sort of pulling issues in every direction, they only met a handful of times. But so the league is a part of that coalition, or that committee rather. How will that shape the study? To be determined.
I would echo that. It seems that this particular study that Let New York Vote is beginning just got derailed by all of the efforts to push election reform through on this session. And the belief was that it could wait. This could wait.
Right, because of the way the constitutional, because I think most groups think that the best thing would be a constitutional amendment, and the way the process works for constitutional amendments, it wasn't necessary to do it this year. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why that got pushed into the next, the Board of Elections reform got pushed into the next legislative session, because it would be possible to have first passage next year. The wording of the study is in the pre-convention kit. It says, it says I don't have it right in front of me now, but the specific wording is in the pre-convention kit, where it talks about recommended board program, because this is a recommended board program item, and it will only take a majority to pass. Board recommended items take a majority to pass. Non-recommended items are voted on for consideration at the first day of plenary, and then they take 2/3 to pass. So I think it's 2/3. I always forget if it's 2/3 or 3/5, but it's more. So if you look at the convention kit, you will see the section on program planning. We'll talk about this in more detail. Or not much more detail, but it'll put out the actual language.
There was another question from Patricia about how local league members can be engaged in the study or become engaged
Well,
for the study. Yeah.
Okay, well, they can express their interest to the office or to me, to email Laura or email Jennifer or email me. I mean, that doesn't, we're gonna try and get what did I do? I stopped my video here. We were gonna try and get sort of a broad cross-section of members from across the state. So there's no guarantee that everyone that volunteers will be able to get on the committee, but we are taking volunteers for sure. And then whenever the recommendations come out of the committee, they'll go to the board and then they'll go out for approval by the members. Okay, any other questions here?
If anyone, I
3/5, right.
I don't see any more
okay.
typed chat questions. If anyone wants to like verbally say a question, you can feel free to raise your hand too.
Go. It's Michelle. Hi, hi Sally. Hi Jennifer. I saw there were some questions in the chat, and Sally, you can probably answer this. I think the question also with the committee is there'll be some work done at the state level, but then all the locals will also consider the materials and the recommendations.
Yes, absolutely. So all members, all local leagues will be encouraged to have a membership meeting on the recommendations of the board for the new position, and all members will also, in keeping with the new way we do consensus, all members will also have the chance to, if they don't participate in a local league meeting, if the local league does not have a meeting, all members will have a chance to weigh in on the new, whether they approve the new position or not.
This is Margaret Goodfellow from the League of Women Voters of Broome and Tioga. Some of the things that Jennifer has discussed early on in her slide deck are certainly issues that we want to look at for consistency and uniformity among boards of elections. I'm sure every one of us here in this meeting can speak to discrepancies and so on that occur for everything from website development to transparencies of meetings. I was a victim of the meeting issue this spring, where a meeting was announced on our Broome County Board of Elections website. I emailed them and said I'd like to be part of the meeting and heard nothing. They not only did not have the meeting online, they didn't respond to me. So we had a conversation about that, and they promised to improve in the future, but they should be doing those meetings transparently anyway. And during the pandemic, they should have been announcing them and putting them on Zoom, and they didn't do any of that. Part of the impetus of doing this study was the never-ending occurrences with the New York 22 race last year. I have copies of all of the judicial documents, not all of them, but the decisions. There were many things about that race that were inexcusable to occur, and one of the final issues was the decision by the Oneida County Board of Elections to not process Department of Motor Vehicle applications, voter registration applications. That was really beyond the pale, and in doing so disenfranchised many people. So in our meetings, in our board meetings, we talked about this race at length, and about issues of political appointees, about issues of procedures and policies for the Board of Elections, and policies that are on record at the Board of Elections. Excuse me, in their rules and regulations, that if they are not complied with, there's no repercussion to a Board of Election for their actions or inactions. So that would be something we would want to have looked at. I don't know if it's possible to do that in this study, but it certainly, pardon me, certainly would be. So all I can say is every day during this New York 22 case was another day and another disaster on the news. It was really very upsetting for us here in Broome and Tioga counties. Of all the counties in New York 22, only Tioga County emerged unscathed by this case. But every other county had repercussions and problems and were cited in this. Everything from Shenango County saying, oh, we just happened to find these ballots in a drawer, in a desk. What do we do with them? Just those kinds of things that were happening almost on a daily basis. And that's a perfect example of inconsistencies in boards of elections in doing their work, doing their operations. I don't think anyone would disagree with what I had to say, but that's certainly a huge impetus for us to write what we did when we said in our program. Thank you. And I'm trying to get, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think clearly sort of standardization across counties and control of local county boards of elections is one of the most important things that the study would be looking at. I mean, I think that that really clearly comes under, you know, the definition of structure.
I have my hand up, but I'm not sure if you're looking that way. Let me ask you a very quick question. I just think this is so wonderful, first of all. Obviously, we need it. What I want to know in terms of process is, why did you decide, or have you been doing this all the time and I've been totally out of it and don't know it? Why did you decide to just do a committee at the state level rather than the individual leagues doing their own committee and then sending their information in there and back up to state? Why did you change that format, or why is
Well,
that?
it's not a change, Georgia. We've always done studies with a committee at the state level does the initial study, then they give the results of the study to the local leagues, and they can have a committee, a study committee at the local level to look at the questions or the recommendation. It used to be in the form of consensus questions. We've moved a little more toward asking local leagues to concur more with positions or revisions than we used to do with questions. But we have always done studies starting at the state level. We've never started, that I'm aware of, started studies at the local level.
Okay, I guess maybe I'm referring to national, you know, where we're set up with having to do two years worth of studying on our own and then coming into the discussion questions. I just need to know what your direction was. That's all. I'm just glad we're doing it. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgia. While we're on the topic of sort of process failure, there's a couple people asking about the timeline for this study in the chat.
Well, I think the timeline, we were hoping that we could get something to local leagues in the sort of late winter, early spring, that it would not take more than a year. So that was sort of that's the initial goal, is to try and get something out there for local leagues to look at in late winter, early spring.
And then, not to belabor this, but I have a feeling another question is going to probably come up. When do you think is the hope that we would approve the position by?
I would hope maybe by the around the March board meeting, March or April in the spring, in time before the end of the legislative session.
Okay, awesome. All right, Barb, you're up.
Okay, my question was about the process. And it sounds like you're thinking of a process somewhat similar to the process that we used for the healthcare, where the state committee put together materials, but also a proposed position that would then go out to local leagues for study? Or are you thinking that it would be materials and questions, and then the position is written after everybody replies?
Okay, I think it will be somewhat of a hybrid, Barb. The healthcare, I think when we put together the new study process, we didn't actually envision it as every word of the position would be written by the committee. That's the way the healthcare committee, that's the direction the healthcare committee took it. But that wasn't actually the original concept in the new study process. It was more that the committee, the state study committee would come with building blocks or principles that would go out to the local leagues for approval or disapproval. And then the state board would take the results of that and craft the actual language of the position. Now, I think part of the reason the healthcare went the way it did is that it was decided to revise the language of existing positions. It was more of an update. You understand what I'm saying? This is actually starting from scratch, because we don't have anything other than that vague statement about efficient and whatever it said from 73, efficient and uniform administration of, that the state has the responsibility for efficient and uniform administration of elections. And I don't know if we can try and find that, more details about that 1973. The reference and impact is to a 1973 omnibus election position, but I've never actually seen the language of that position. And when I asked Amy, I've asked around a little bit. Remember, we did ask around a little bit, and no one actually could remember that position. That makes sense. So we're not revising the language of existing positions. We are trying to come up with a new position from building blocks.
Great. Patricia, I see your hands up too.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment a little bit on that process, because I think so many of us at the local level are dealing with the Board of Elections, and it almost seems like the input into the study would be so helpful, because at a New York, across the New York State level, it's much different than if you're living it at the local level. So we'd like to see if we could have a process in order there to be input from the bottom up, where it's very different, as we've so noted, county election board to a county election board, that it would be, I think, would be really helpful to the study group to have that input. So that's just basically a comment that I'll put into about the process.
Oh no, I'm sure that the committee I expect the committee will be very open to getting local league input at the beginning of the process. And that's a very good suggestion.
Yeah, I'll just follow it up with, Sally, maybe one of the best things to do is to just put out a Google survey that allows people to enter some of the questions and concerns that they have, so that you can kind of mass gather it in a pretty efficient way. I just would suggest that as a possible procedural process.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave that somewhat. I think we'll have to work with Laura in the office about that, because she's more aware of sort of how, what the most expeditious and least burdensome way to gather input from local leagues is than I am. Okay, the answer to Lori's question, anyone from local leagues can volunteer to be part of the state study group, but we're going to try and we are conscious of the need to have the study group sort of cover, you know, a variety of bases. So we're not guaranteeing that anyone that volunteers to be on the study group will get on it, if that's clear, Lori. I don't know. I don't think we haven't determined what the size will be yet. Partly that's going to depend upon when we haven't, remember everybody, that this study has not been approved yet. It has to be approved by the delegates at convention. So I think Kate and I will sit down and put our heads together and look at the volunteers and try and think of, you know, what the optimal size will be, but we haven't determined that yet. I'm sorry, that was Jane's question.
Great.
May I
Anybody
ask
else? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Maureen.
Maureen Murray from the League of Women Voters of the Cooperstown area. I've been very interested in this presentation and certainly strongly support the effort to get at accountability for the boards of elections. I had an experience where after cooperative commissioners in Otsego County worked with us, and we hauled them over the county to visit 5 high schools in 2 days. I think I wanted to send a thank you note, not only to the commissioners, but to their supervisor. And I had to keep asking who that was, and it's no one nearby. That experience, plus some sense that no one is asking them for metrics. How many of these have they done? How many high schools have they gotten to? It took the league to actually get them out to the high schools, even though it's written in some of their requirements that they contact the high school. So yes, they send a letter to the high school, not an individual, about registering high school seniors and juniors. And of course, they get no response, so they don't have to get themselves to the high schools. It was the league that said, hey, let's do this together. So I really would love to see some better accountability and some metrics that they are required to report to somebody more local than the governor.
Maureen, here in Broome County, we've been looking at the 2019 bill that was passed requiring that Board of Education have, that relates to the 16 and 17-year-olds being eligible to pre-register to vote. And we have found that in the 2019 legislation that passed locally in Broome and Tahoe County, only 5 school districts have a written policy on the subject matter. So this goes back a little bit to when you were talking about the Board of Elections contacting local school districts. It's my understanding that they, like you said, they do a letter or a mailer and they send some forms out to the school district. And that is really the limit of their obligation to school districts, which is really deplorable, actually. And what we would like to see is that to be improved, of course, and also to have the reporting requirement for that at the state level. They are required to submit a report to the New York State Board of Elections every year on what their activities are and what their plans are for the next year. And it goes to the New York State Board of Elections and no one ever sees it. Doesn't appear to be accessible by anyone. So that would be something that would fall under the category of accountability. You know, what exactly are you doing? Are you contacting high schools? Well, what exactly precisely is the process that you're using? What are your metrics? What are you getting back from them? The same would go for nursing homes and in places like that, where I believe the law says you have to have, you're only required to physically visit a nursing home if there are 25 residents that are already registered to vote, which is even more deplorable. So I, there are so many different avenues that and things that should be looked at regarding registration in general for a number of different population groups, youth, the elderly, the disabled, folks in jail, and what those outreach programs look like, what kind of metrics they use, if any, and what they're doing year to year to improve their performance.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret.
Great. Kate, did you want to add something?
Yes, thank you. It would seem intuitive to believe that county boards of elections would be beholden to the state board of elections. I mean, it's a superstructure that's imposed on top of them. But I think Sally mentioned in one of her slides, the state board of elections didn't exist at all until 1974. And the county boards of election structure is older than we are, older than 100 years. And there is a lot of tension between them. There is disdain in some cases as to, who are you to tell me what to do? I mean, the county's looking at the state and say, we know what we're doing. And there's a lot of non-compliance. Jennifer mentioned strongly worded letters, and it doesn't go beyond that. And perhaps this is something that we can focus on in our study, that they'll change something in the statute to make things a little bit more, put some teeth into that. But that's the reason that there's so little uniformity, that there's not transparency, and that there's no, the state board might tell them what to do, but they're gonna maybe thumb their nose. And that's very problematic.
Arlene, I see your hand physically up.
I just wanted to comment in response to what someone else said, that back in the 1980s and 1990s, the Board of Election in Nassau County automatically sent a big stack of voter registration forms to the social studies chairman at each high school. And then the social studies teachers did the voter registration of their seniors. So that ended. That does not automatically take place anymore. I just wanted to say it did at one time. Okay.
One point I want to make in response to maybe a couple of these chats talking about reaching out to local leagues is Judy knows this much better than I do, but I think we already at least annually ask local leagues, and especially during the early voting process, we ask local leagues for input on their interactions and the operations of their county boards. Don't we, Judy? Oh, you have to unmute, Judy.
Yes,
sorry.
We've encouraged for the past several years leagues to have contact with their Board of Elections and to do follow-up after the election, to have good communication. And I would say about half of our leagues are reporting that they do have good relationships. So this would just be continuing the work with them.
And I have to say on a different subject too, also that I don't expect that there's so many sort of big issues that the committee has to look at. I'm not sure to what extent the position will go into things that impact more voter services, even if they are things that county boards we think should be doing better, that it'll focus more on a bigger picture issue of accountability and responsibilities, as opposed to some of the more nitty gritty of, are they registering 16 or 17-year-olds? I think that we're looking at things on a slightly sort of higher, more global level of structure and functioning, as opposed to what they're currently doing or not doing. Does that make sense? So some of these things we're talking about are very important, but they really fall more in our voter services work than they would in our advocacy work. Because the end result of this will be give the league something that we can use to evaluate structural reform proposals that we hope will be sort of coming out of the woodwork next year, next session.
Great, Arlene, I see your hand up again.
I just wanted to say, I was the person that asked, where is the wording of the study in the, and I knew it was on that page. It's just that it's so, it's such a short, all it does is say we'll be looking at the structure of election administration. And so I thought that there should be subheads and things so that people understand what the study is going to involve. I thought it should be a little more specific.
Well, some of that, Arlene, is going to be determined by the committee.
Okay.
So if we put too many parameters on the committee ahead of time, then that doesn't allow, they're going to start doing the research and they're going to start looking at other state positions. They're going to be doing things. We don't really want to hamstring the committee into this things, how they will structure the study, if that makes sense, because it may evolve. And if we hamstring them and say, well, this is what the delegates approved, you must do X, Y, Z, they get in to start the study and they say, well, Z isn't important. We really also need to look at A. That's important. Then they might not be able to do that. So we don't want to over prescribe what the committee is going to look at. I mean, I don't know if you know, I can come up with a couple more sentences to talk about what we mean by structure, but I guess I thought it was fairly apparent that we're talking about like what type of administration, like who's in charge of the state of election administration, who's in charge at the state level, who's in charge at the local levels, how's the distribution of responsibilities, how's the accountability, how are people appointed. That's really what I think goes to the structure.
Oh, okay.
Sally, I think what you're saying is you're leaving it open-ended so that the committee is able to find out, right? How they
Right,
want
that's right.
the direction. If she tries to be too specific, it can deter the process.
Sally, wouldn't it also, on a umbrella type of thing, would be involved in enforcement of policy and New York State election law on the part of the New York State Board of Elections and their influences on County Board of Elections and their activities?
No, I think we've all agreed that will very likely be a major component. Now, what I'm not sure will be a major component of the results of this, or what will be covered in the study, is the enforcement of campaign finance laws, because that's another big, it's sort of an issue in and of itself now. So to what extent that might be taken out of Board of Elections and given to whatever kind of entity replaces JCOPE, hopefully sooner rather than later. That I don't know. I mean, that's one of the things maybe we'll have on the initial list that the committee looks at. But given the fact that we want to get this done in a expeditious manner, I'm not sure that we'll be able to cover everything. So there may be some things that maybe we'll have to whittle down the list to make sure we get this done as a 1-year study, not a 4-year study.
Great, and there's a question from Karen in the chat. Would there be any consideration of going to a Secretary of State instead of State Board of Elections?
Yes, I think that will be clearly part of the study, because that's the predominant model in other states. It's not every state, but it's the majority of states. Oh, Kate's saying we had a Secretary of State. Oh, okay. So
yes, and the idea was, it was every time we had a new election, a new governor, new Secretary of State, things completely were turned upside down, and they were more partisan than they are now. So the idea with this reform of enshrining the Ds and the Rs in the election law was that they would watch over each other, and one of them wouldn't let the other one do anything illegal or monstrous. But so anyway, that's this. The current system was considered a big time reform, but now we have what we have. And 100 years later, I guess it's time to look at it, right?
Look what they did to Raffensperger down in Georgia.
I believe there are some states that have nonpartisan election administration. I don't know if we've ever had anything like that in New York State, but I believe there are some states that do.
The problem with trying to, I mean, and this is, I'm part of another organization that's also looking at this. And when you have to somehow get to an appointment process to appoint a board or appoint a one official, and how you try and make that a nonpartisan process of getting that official appointed, that's where sort of the devil is in the details. So about how you appoint a nonpartisan single official or board, because you still have to get them from somewhere if they're not elected.
Right. But that will come up perhaps in the study of other states, and perhaps.
Yes, yes, it will. It will. That's, I think that's sort of the very first initial question. In addition to sort of what sort of we want the result to be, but with the start looking at the other states, start looking at other state league positions. So that'll sort of, help determine the parameters and the end result. Are there any other questions or?
Dorothy asked if the Secretary of State was appointed or elected for that position when it was the voting authority.
Kate, I wasn't even living in New York then, but do you know?
None of us on this call were alive at that time. So the answer is I do not know, but clearly whether elected on the same slate as the governor or appointed when the governor was installed, they were of the same mind as the sitting governor.
Great. And then Emily asked, has National League ever done a study like this?
No, because national leagues really leave these type of state issues, for example, like term limits is another one, or the structure of the legislature. They really leave those to individual states to study, because as they like to say, each state is different. So no. I mean, they have principles of transparency and accountability and access that we have applied sort of, and the right to vote that we have applied sort of, we apply to various laws that we look at in New York State. We take these principles, but they're not going to recommend that a Secretary of State model is the best or a bipartisan. The answer on we haven't looked at that yet, whether other states have done studies or not. We're still in the process of approving this study for us. So when we approve this study for us, then that will be one of the first things that we do, is to look at, have other states evaluated, have other states approved new system recently, have the state leagues weighed in on whatever new system that state is getting. That's going to be one of the first things we do. I think I said that in the slide.
Great. And I think that answers Emily's other question, what other leagues states have done this. I think we're not sure yet. I'm pretty sure Minnesota has, because I think at one point I had a conversation with them about this, but I bet it's many more than just that.
And I know Wisconsin used to have a sort of appointed nonpartisan system that was lauded as a good system, but then recently they did away with it because the parties didn't like it, because the political parties like to be in charge of elections. So I think that may be, Wisconsin may be another state that we want to look to. And the other thing that comes into this always is that, you know, New York, we don't have initiative and referendum, but other states are able to do things like change their election administration systems through voter initiated referenda, which we can't do here.
And then Mary Kate, oh, yeah, you already read it.
Yeah, I saw that. I think it's sort of too early for me to give an answer to that. I don't think funding is going to be a major subject of the study, because we right now know we want elections to be fully and fairly funded. So that's just a general principle we have right now. So I'm not sure that funding will be one of the major subjects of the study, but that's somewhat up to the committee to decide. Because if one concern I have, if they take on too much and too many facets of elections that don't sort of directly go with the structure, then we might not get it done on a timely basis. And we know that we're already, Jennifer's already the leading advocate in Albany on funding elections. So I'm not sure that it necessarily has to be something that this committee spends a lot of time on, because we know what we think is right there.
Great. And there was one other question about the referendum process and not having a referendum process, if that's something that is from our state constitution, or if that's like a general.
No, it's in the Constitution. There's no provision for it in the Constitution. So, except with one exception, there's a referendum whether to hold a constitutional convention or not has to come up every 10 years. That's in the Constitution. Other than that, and New Yorkers get to vote on bond proposals, and they get to vote on things put by the legislature on the ballots, but they don't get to. There's no provision for citizen initiated voting. We would have to change the Constitution to get that.
Yeah.
And that could only be done probably through a constitutional convention. I can't see the legislature saying, oh, well, we want to give people the right to put things on the ballot. That seems sort of a stretch.
And Stephanie asked if the S1 HR1 at the federal level, if that's going to have, if we'll be studying that and what the effect could be on this.
Well, that is really more to the mechanics of voting. It mandates specific mechanics like availability of absentee, no excuse. I think, I'm not an expert on this one, but I think no excuse absentee and so many days of early voting, that's strongly supported by National. So of course we support it also. So that will not, I don't believe there's any part of that goes to the structure of election administration. I think there may be some parts of it that go to tracking ballots, right, Jennifer, and things like that, and ballot curing. But I don't think there's nothing that says who in a state, what's the mechanism in a state for running elections. It's the mechanics of how the elections are conducted and how the ballots are counted and what the states have to do to make voting easier. But I don't think it's like who runs the election systems that I know of. I mean, there's a lot in the bill. It's a very long bill. That's one of the critiques of it. But I don't really know if there's that much interaction between this study and that bill.
Any other questions from anybody?
Yeah, I'll raise my hand.
I heard someone say they were going to raise their hand too. I just see Barb Thomas's hand up though.
Hey,
Oh, was you? Okay, okay.
I didn't realize I was unmuted. I just was concerned that we remember that the structure in the local county boards of election is that the commissioners are appointed by their party, and then actually the county legislature or boards of supervisors appoint the people that have been recommended by the parties. And the funding comes from the state to the county, which has to then move some funding over. But the county is also responsible. So there's kind of that split administration of that can be a real problem. I don't know how it works in every county. In our county, we happen to have very professional commissioners in both parties. One a bit more responsive than the other, but so it's good. But I know that other counties have very, very part-time people. And of course, there are differences between counties. I know Sally used the example of Hamilton County. Well, I think they have about 4,500 people that live in Hamilton County. And it's as big geographically, probably bigger than Queens. So for people to come on a very limited number of roads to a polling place, it's different. But it's also that it's very hard to get people to even be election inspectors in these far-flung communities. And they've had to sometimes close polling places because they simply cannot find enough staffing to keep them open. So I think, it's not all the kind of really high population, just like that rule that said that primaries have to be open from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Well, that makes for a very boring day for those election inspectors.
Yes, but but Barb, you have to remember when Georgia changed that rule, partly because of that reason. That's part of the big pushback they got for changing it and not mandating long hours in every single county.
And it seems to me that we should look at maybe recommending different rules for presidential and gubernatorial election years. I don't know.
I think, Barb, you're getting into veering off a little bit out of the purpose of this study. I don't think it's going to get into those kinds of mechanics. It's going to be a little more of a higher level. Who's responsible for what and what should be the qualifications of the people administering the elections, as opposed to how consistent I don't know to what level we want to start getting into how consistent the mechanics of voting should be across counties. Maybe we do, but I wouldn't necessarily think that this study committee is going to focus on things like, do we need less early voting in more sparsely populated counties?
I wouldn't think that.
Great. Any final questions? Awesome. Okay, well then I think we can actually wrap a little early, which is nice. If people think of questions or comments or anything as we're sort of going through and getting to approving the study, feel free to email me. I'm about to put my email in the chat. If you don't already know it, it's super easy. It's jennifer@lwvny.org, and we can work on addressing any other questions or issues that come up after this that you all might think of. But if nothing else, then we'll see you all at the next round of workshops at 7:30. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Thank
Thank
you all for
you.
such a great attendance. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
That was great.